The winter of 1897 descended upon Boston with a cruelty that matched the stone walls of St. Agnes Convent. Ice crept across the harbor like God's own judgment, silencing the ships and muffling the city's industrial heartbeat. The convent stood at the edge of the water, its gray towers rising against pewter skies, Gothic windows dark as closed eyes. Sister Margaret pressed her weathered hands against the frost-covered glass of her office window, watching the last ferry struggle through the ice floes. At 53, she carried the weight of 13 years as Mother Superior, with the same rigid posture she'd maintained since taking her vows at 19. Her face, angular and severe beneath her wimple, bore the expression of perpetual disappointment, as if the world had failed to live up to the standards she'd set for it. "The Lord sends us this cold to test our faith," she murmured, her breath fogging the glass. Behind her, the convent's ledger lay open on her desk, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Names, dates, transgressions, everything accounted for, everything measured against the impossible yardstick of perfection she wielded like a weapon. Down in the chapel, 6 young sisters knelt in prayer, their habits pooling around them on the cold stone floor. Sister Catherine, barely 22, shivered despite her wool layers. Beside her, Sister Anne pressed her rosary beads so tightly her knuckles had gone white. They'd been kneeling for 3 hours now, penance for Sister Catherine's perceived impudence at breakfast when she'd suggested the orphans might benefit from warmer blankets. "Pride," Sister Margaret had declared, her voice echoing through the dining hall. "Pride in thinking you know better than those placed above you. 3 hours before the altar, both of you, contemplating your presumption." Sister Anne had done nothing but sit beside Catherine. That was offense enough. The convent of St. Agnes housed 17 souls that winter. Sister Margaret, 12 sisters ranging from 19 to 47, and the ghost of everything it had once aspired to be. Founded in 1862 by French Ursulines seeking to educate Boston's Catholic daughters, it had gradually transformed under Sister Margaret's leadership into something else entirely. A fortress of discipline where devotion was measured in obedience and love expressed through submission. The wealthy families of Boston's North End sent their difficult daughters here, along with generous donations. The Archdiocese appreciated St. Agnes's discretion, its ability to handle delicate situations without scandal. Behind those stone walls, rebellious girls became compliant wives, pregnant daughters disappeared for 9 months, and the uncomfortable truths of Boston's Catholic elite were managed with efficiency and silence. Sister Margaret had perfected the art of institutional discretion. She understood that power in the Church came not from challenging the hierarchy, but from making oneself indispensable to it. She was the woman called upon when whispers needed to stop, when reputations needed protection, when wealthy benefactors required assurances that certain matters would be handled appropriately. But even perfect systems develop cracks. Sister Catherine rose from her knees, swaying slightly from the hours of immobility. Her legs screamed with pins and needles as circulation returned. Beside her, Sister Anne remained motionless, still deep in forced prayer or perhaps unconscious. It was becoming harder to tell the difference. "Anne," Catherine whispered, touching her companion's shoulder. "Anne, we're released." The younger woman's eyes opened, but they seemed to look through Catherine rather than at her. In the dim candlelight of the chapel, her face appeared skull-like, hollowed by weeks of inadequate meals and excessive penance. "We should go to the refectory," Catherine said gently, helping Anne to her feet. "There might be soup left." "I'm not hungry," Anne replied, her voice thin as paper. "I should pray more. I should pray until I'm worthy." Catherine felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not hunger, though she was desperately hungry, but fear. She'd seen this before, in her older sister who'd spent 2 years at St. Agnes before being returned to their family, broken in ways that couldn't be explained in polite company. The same hollow-eyed devotion, the same terrible eagerness to suffer. That night, as the wind howled off the frozen harbor and rattled the convent's ancient windows, Catherine sat in her narrow cell and did something that would have been considered heresy within these walls. She allowed herself to doubt. She thought of Sister Mary Catherine, who'd transferred to a convent in New Hampshire 3 months ago. The departure had been sudden, the goodbye perfunctory. Catherine remembered the fear in Mary Catherine's eyes during her last week, the way she'd started at every sound, the mysterious bruises on her wrists that she'd explained away as clumsiness. She thought of Sister Josephine, sent to rest at a sanitarium after her nervous collapse. Josephine, who'd been bright and questioning, who'd dared to ask why the orphans received such meager portions when the convent's coffers swelled with donations from the Cabot and Lodge families. She thought of Sister Bernadette, who'd simply vanished one February morning. Called by God to missionary work, Sister Margaret had announced at breakfast, her tone brooking no questions. The other sisters had nodded, accepting, trained not to doubt. But Catherine was beginning to see a pattern in the departures. They always happened to sisters who asked questions, who showed independence, who threatened the careful balance Sister Margaret had constructed. They happened quietly, without witnesses, explained away with convenient narratives that no one dared to challenge. In the darkness of her cell, listening to Anne's restless prayers through the thin wall, Catherine made a decision that would set everything in motion. She would write a letter. She would tell someone outside these walls what was happening at St. Agnes. She would expose them. 3 floors below, in her private quarters warmed by a small coal stove that no other sister was permitted, Sister Margaret knelt before her personal altar. Candles cast dancing shadows across her face as she prayed with the fevered intensity that had sustained her for 3 decades. "Lord, preserve your servant from those who would destroy your work," she whispered. "Grant me the strength to do what must be done. Steel my heart against false compassion. Help me to be as ruthless in your service as you were with the money changers in the temple." She'd received word that afternoon from Father Murphy, the elderly confessor who'd served St. Agnes for 20 years. He was retiring, returning to Ireland to die among his own people. His replacement would arrive in the spring, a young priest from the cathedral, educated at the seminary in Baltimore, full of modern ideas about pastoral care and transparency. The old order was passing. Everything Margaret had built, everything she'd sacrificed to create, was threatened by the soft weakness of a new generation that confused sentimentality with faith. She'd also intercepted a letter that afternoon, Catherine's letter addressed to the offices of the Boston Globe, hidden in the outgoing mail. Margaret had read it in the privacy of her office, her hands trembling with rage at the betrayal. The girl had detailed everything: the excessive punishments, the financial irregularities, the suspicious transfers, the way wealthy families paid to have their inconvenient daughters hidden away. Catherine had to be dealt with. And Anne, who'd surely been told of these plans, and any others who might be infected with their rebellious poison. Sister Margaret rose from her prayers, her decision made with the cold certainty she mistook for divine guidance. She would not permit the destruction of all she'd built. God's work required hard choices, required the willingness to cut away diseased flesh to save the body. She moved to her desk and withdrew a heavy ledger bound in black leather. Opening it, she began to write, her penmanship as precise and controlled as everything else about her. She recorded names, dates, the necessary steps to preserve St. Agnes from contamination. Outside, the temperature plummeted to 15 degrees below zero. The harbor froze solid for the first time in a decade. Ships were trapped in ice, unable to move forward or back. The city held its breath, waiting for the thaw that seemed like it might never come. In her cell, Catherine pressed her letter between the pages of her prayer book, planning to smuggle it out with the milkman in the morning. She didn't know that her words had already been read, that her fate had already been decided, that by writing the truth she'd sealed herself into a tomb of stone and sanctimony. The bells of St. Agnes tolled for Compline, calling the sisters to the final prayer of the day. Their voices rose in unison, singing the ancient words, "Visit, we beseech thee, O Lord, this dwelling, and drive far from it all the snares of the enemy." But the enemy was already inside the walls, disguised as devotion, armed with absolute certainty, convinced that any sin could be justified if committed in God's name. The frozen harbor held its silence. The convent settled into darkness, and Sister Margaret, kneeling in her private chapel, smiled the terrible smile of the righteous preparing for war. The disappearances began with Sister Anne. On the night of January 15th, Catherine woke to the sound of muffled footsteps in the corridor outside her cell. The convent maintained strict silence after Compline, so any movement at this hour, she guessed it was past 2 in the morning, was unusual enough to pull her from uneasy sleep. She lay still, listening, as the footsteps paused outside Anne's door next to hers. A key turned in a lock, whispered voices, too low to distinguish words, then silence again, stretching out until Catherine wondered if she'd dreamed the whole thing. In the morning, Anne's cell was empty. Her bed, always so meticulously made, showed signs of hasty departure. the blanket pulled back, her prayer book lying open on the floor, her rosary beads scattered across the worn floorboards. "Sister Anne has been called to serve at our sister convent in Worcester," Sister Margaret announced at breakfast, her voice as flat and unremarkable as if she were commenting on the weather. "She left early this morning. We should all pray for her safe journey and successful work among the orphans there." Catherine's spoon clattered against her bowl. Around the refectory table, 12 pairs of eyes remained fixed downward, studying thin porridge as if it held divine revelation. But she said nothing. Catherine protested, her voice sounding too loud in the enforced quiet. "She would have." "Sister Catherine," Margaret's voice cut like a blade, "are you suggesting that I'm lying to you?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Every sister at the table went absolutely still, the kind of frozen alertness prey animals display when a predator passes nearby. "No, Mother Superior," Catherine said, but she couldn't make herself sound convincing. "I only meant, you meant to question your superior's word. You meant to sow doubt and discord among your sisters." Margaret rose from her chair at the head of the table, and even at her modest height, she seemed to tower over them all. "This is precisely the kind of pride and disobedience that required correction in Sister Anne. I had hoped her example might teach you humility, but I see that lesson has not yet taken root." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. Her example. As if Anne's suffering had been pedagogical. As if cruelty could be justified as education. "Tonight, after Vespers, you will keep vigil in the chapel until dawn," Margaret continued, kneeling, in silence, contemplating the sin of presumption. "Do you understand?" "Yes, Mother Superior." But Catherine didn't understand. Or rather, she understood too well. Anne hadn't left early that morning for Worcester. Anne had been taken, removed, disappeared in the night like Sister Mary Catherine before her, like Sister Josephine, like Bernadette. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Catherine went through the motions of her duties, teaching Latin to the 3 young girls boarding at the convent, mending linens in the workroom, helping prepare the evening meal, but her mind raced with terrible possibilities. At Vespers, she knelt among her sisters and sang the ancient hymns, but she was watching Margaret. The Mother Superior stood apart, as always, her face composed in an expression of serene authority. But Catherine noticed things she'd missed before. The way Margaret's eyes constantly moved, cataloging, assessing, the tension in her shoulders despite her appearance of calm, the way her lips moved in what might have been prayer but looked more like calculation. After the service, as the other sisters filed out to their cells, Catherine remained in the chapel as commanded. The heavy door closed behind them with a boom that echoed through the vaulted space, and she was alone with the flickering candles and her growing dread. She knelt before the altar, a new construction that had been installed just 3 months ago. Margaret had claimed the old wooden altar was unsuitable for a convent of St. Agnes's standing, and had commissioned this massive marble replacement from Italian craftsmen. The work had taken weeks, required the temporary closure of the chapel, and involved extensive modifications to the stone floor beneath. The altar was beautiful, Catherine had to admit, white marble veined with gray, inlaid with gold crosses, imposing in its solid permanence. But something about it had always unsettled her. Perhaps it was the way Margaret looked at it, with a possessive pride that seemed inappropriate for a woman who'd taken vows of poverty and humility. Hours passed. Catherine's knees screamed against the stone floor. Her back spasmed. Her neck ached from holding her head in the prescribed position of prayer. But she remained, because disobedience meant punishment, and punishment at St. Agnes had become something to fear. At some point past midnight she heard it, a sound from beneath the altar, faint, so faint she almost thought she'd imagined it. A scratching perhaps, or the whisper of fabric against stone. Then nothing, just the wind outside and the settling of old timbers. Catherine's skin prickled. She told herself she was being foolish, that hours of discomfort and fear were making her hear things that weren't there. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong about the chapel, about the altar, about the very ground beneath her knees. When dawn finally broke and the bells rang for lauds, Catherine stumbled to her feet, dizzy and disoriented. Sister Margaret appeared in the chapel doorway, backlit by the gray morning light, looking almost spectral. "I trust your night of reflection was profitable," Margaret said. "Tell me, Sister Catherine, have you gained any insight into your failings?" Catherine wanted to scream. She wanted to demand answers about Anne, about all the sisters who'd vanished. She wanted to run from this place and never look back. But she was 22 years old, orphaned, with no money and nowhere to go. St. Agnes was her home, whether she wanted it to be or not. Yes, Mother Superior, she lied. I understand now. Good. Margaret's smile was cold. Then perhaps there's hope for your soul after all. But there was no hope, Catherine realized as she walked on trembling legs back to her cell. Not for her, not for any of them. They were trapped in this place with a woman who'd confused power with piety, who'd built her own small kingdom and would destroy anyone who threatened it. Over the following weeks, 3 more sisters vanished. Sister Helena, who'd been at St. Agnes for 8 years, was sent to nurse the sick in a hospital in Providence. She left behind all her possessions, including the silver cross given to her by her dying mother. Sister Cecilia received a family emergency that called her home to New York. No letter arrived afterward, no word of her safe arrival, nothing. Sister Teresa was deemed unsuitable for religious life and expelled from the order. Sister Margaret personally escorted her to the ferry terminal on a bitter February morning. Teresa never arrived at the address she'd given Margaret. Her only living relative, an aunt in Cambridge, received no visit and filed a missing persons report that went nowhere. With each disappearance, the convent grew quieter. The remaining sisters moved through their days like ghosts, speaking only when necessary, avoiding eye contact, terrified of drawing Margaret's attention. The wealthy girls still boarded there, ignorant of the tension, focused on their own dramas. The orphans still received their inadequate meals and harsh discipline. The donations still poured in from Boston's Catholic elite. And Sister Margaret still kept her meticulous ledgers, recording everything, controlling everything, convinced that she alone understood what God required. Catherine began her own secret documentation. She'd abandoned any thought of writing to newspapers. Clearly, Margaret monitored all outgoing mail. Instead, she kept a journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her cell, recording dates, details, suspicious circumstances. If something happened to her, she wanted there to be a record. She wanted someone someday to know the truth. On the last day of February, Catherine was summoned to Margaret's office after matins. She climbed the stairs with leaden feet, certain that her time had come, that she would be next to transfer or take ill, or simply cease to exist. Margaret sat behind her desk, the winter sun casting her face in sharp relief. She looked older than her 53 years, drawn and haggard as if maintaining her iron control was draining the life from her. Sit, Margaret commanded. Catherine sat, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. I've been praying about you, Margaret said, praying hard. God has shown me that you possess great potential for holiness, but you're being led astray by weakness and doubt. The other sisters, the ones who left, they were corrupted beyond saving. But you, Sister Catherine, you might still be redeemed. Catherine said nothing. Every word felt like a trap. I'm going to give you a choice, Margaret continued. You can submit fully to the discipline of this house, accept my guidance without question, and perhaps save your immortal soul. Or you can continue on your current path of skepticism and pride, and suffer the consequences. She paused, her eyes boring into Catherine's. What will you choose? It wasn't really a choice, and they both knew it. Catherine could submit, and slowly lose herself in the grinding machinery of obedience and fear, or she could resist and disappear like the others. Either way, the woman she'd been was dying. I submit, Catherine whispered, hating herself for the words even as she spoke them. Margaret smiled, and in that smile was something worse than cruelty. It was satisfaction, the pleasure of breaking another will to match her own. Excellent. Then we understand each other. You'll begin a special course of spiritual exercises designed to strengthen your faith. We'll start tonight, in the chapel. After Compline, you'll join me for private prayer before the altar. Catherine felt ice water flood her veins. The altar, the sounds she'd heard, the strange smell that sometimes seeped through the stone, the massive marble structure beneath which something felt fundamentally wrong. Yes, Mother Superior, she said, because there was nothing else to say. That night, as Catherine knelt beside Sister Margaret in the empty chapel, the older woman's voice rose and fell in fervent prayer. The words were Latin, ancient and powerful, but to Catherine they sounded like incantation, like something darker than devotion. And beneath the altar, in the hollow space created by Italian craftsmen who'd been paid to ask no questions, 5 bodies lay wrapped in habits preserved by the winter cold, waiting for spring when they might begin to speak through rot and decay of the terrible things done in God's name. Father Thomas Byrne arrived at St. Agnes on a rain-soaked morning in late March, carrying a single battered suitcase and the idealism of a man who'd spent more time with books than people. At 28, he was young for a parish assignment, but Bishop O'Malley had assured him this would be straightforward work, hearing confessions, saying Mass for the sisters and their charges, providing spiritual guidance to a small, devoted community. Sister Margaret runs a tight ship, the bishop had said, which Thomas had interpreted as praise for efficiency. He'd soon learn that tight ship was a diplomatic euphemism for something far more troubling. The convent loomed before him like a medieval fortress, its stone walls blackened by decades of coal smoke and salt air. The harbor, now free of ice, lapped at the nearby docks where fishing boats unloaded their catches. The smell of the sea mixed with something else, something faintly rotten that Thomas couldn't quite place. Sister Margaret met him at the massive oak door, her face arranged in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was smaller than he'd expected, but there was something formidable in her bearing, a sense of absolute authority that reminded him of the strict headmistress at his childhood school. Father Byrne, welcome to St. Agnes. We've been expecting you. She led him through dark corridors lined with religious paintings, their subjects' eyes seeming to follow his progress. Father Murphy spoke highly of you in his letter. Father Murphy is very kind, Thomas replied, trying to match her brisk pace. I hope to serve this community as faithfully as he did. Father Murphy understood the importance of respecting established order, Margaret said, and something in her tone made it clear this was both statement and warning. A confessor's role is to guide souls toward salvation, not to interfere with the practical administration of a religious house. Thomas made a non-committal sound. He'd studied canon law at seminary. He understood the delicate balance between religious communities and their chaplains, but he'd also been taught that a priest's first duty was to his conscience and his parishioners, not to institutional convenience. His quarters were Spartan, a small room adjacent to the chapel with a narrow bed, a desk, a crucifix on the wall. From his window, he could see a small cemetery where past sisters of the convent rested beneath weathered headstones. Beyond that, the harbor stretched to the horizon, vast and indifferent. That first week passed in a blur of routine. He said daily Mass in the chapel, the sisters' voices rising in practiced harmony during hymns. He heard confessions, though most of the sisters seemed to confess only the most minor and formulaic sins, impure thoughts, moments of irritation, failures of perfect charity. Their confessions felt rehearsed, as if they were reciting from a script rather than examining their consciences. Only one sister seemed truly troubled, Sister Catherine, a young woman with intelligent eyes and a perpetual wariness that reminded Thomas of someone living under constant surveillance. Her confessions were elliptical, full of hints and implications she never quite spoke aloud. Father, is it sinful to doubt those in authority over us? She asked during their first confession. That depends, Thomas said carefully, on whether the authority is being exercised justly and in accordance with God's will. A long pause. He could hear her breathing on the other side of the screen, could sense her weighing words, deciding how much to risk. And if the authority is, not just if it causes harm, then we have not only the right but the obligation to speak truth to that power, Thomas said, though wisdom and prudence should guide how we do so. Another pause then. Thank you, Father. She left without absolution for any specific sin, leaving Thomas troubled and uncertain. Something was wrong at St. Agnes, but he couldn't yet see its shape. His first real glimpse came 2 weeks into his tenure, when he asked Margaret for the parish records. As chaplain, he needed to update the registry of sisters, note baptisms and confirmations among the boarding students, review the accounts of charitable giving. Margaret's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, Father, though I should mention that our records are in the process of being reorganized. Some documents may be temporarily misplaced. I see, Thomas said, though he didn't, not yet. Perhaps I could help with the reorganization? That won't be necessary. I'll have the available records sent to your quarters. What arrived that afternoon was selective at best. Ledgers showing donations and expenses, but with curious gaps. The registry of sisters showed numerous departures over the past year, all neatly explained. Transfers, family emergencies, health concerns. But there were inconsistencies that troubled Thomas's orderly mind. Sisters who'd supposedly transferred to other convents, but whose receiving houses weren't listed. Departure dates that seemed to cluster suspiciously around certain events. He decided to write to some of the convents mentioned in the records. Simple letters of introduction from a new chaplain, inquiring after former sisters of St. Agnes. The replies, when they came, were illuminating. Most reported they had no record of ever receiving the sisters in question. One Mother Superior wrote back with barely concealed irritation, "We have not accepted transfers from St. Agnes in over 3 years, and I must ask you to correct your records accordingly." Thomas sat in his small room, the letters spread before him, and felt the first stirrings of genuine alarm. 7 sisters supposedly transferred. None had arrived at their stated destinations. So where were they? He began asking careful questions, speaking to the remaining 8 sisters individually, trying to reconstruct a timeline. Most were too frightened to speak openly, but he pieced together fragments. Sister Mary Catherine had left her prayer book behind, something unthinkable for a devout woman embarking on a new assignment. Sister Josephine had seemed terrified in her final weeks. Speaking of knowing too much, Sister Bernadette had told Catherine she had no intention of leaving, just days before she supposedly departed for missionary work. "Father," Catherine finally whispered to him after Mass one morning, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "They didn't leave. None of them left." "Then where are they?" Thomas asked, though he was beginning to suspect an answer he didn't want to believe. Catherine's eyes drifted toward the chapel, toward the massive marble altar that dominated the space. "I hear things at night," she said, "from beneath, and there's a smell sometimes, when the weather turns warm." Sister Margaret had that altar installed last autumn. Before that, the floor was excavated. Workmen were here for weeks, but we weren't allowed to watch, weren't permitted to ask questions. Thomas felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. "You're saying?" "I'm saying I think they're still here, Father. I think they never left at all." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He paced his small room, wrestling with implications too monstrous to fully accept. Murder, in a convent, committed by a woman who claimed to serve God. Bodies hidden beneath an altar, beneath the very place where Christ's sacrifice was meant to be commemorated. It was obscene. It was impossible. It had to be investigated, but carefully. If he was wrong, he'd destroy innocent reputations and his own credibility. If he was right, he was potentially in danger himself. A woman who'd killed 7 times wouldn't hesitate at an 8th victim, particularly one threatening to expose her. He decided to start with the chapel itself. The next afternoon, claiming he wanted to clean and prepare the space for Holy Week services, he spent hours examining every inch of the altar and the floor around it. The marble was solid, professionally installed, offering no obvious access to whatever might lie beneath. But there were inconsistencies. Fresh mortar along the base that didn't match the rest, slight discolorations in the stone floor, and that smell Catherine had mentioned, faint but unmistakable on warmer days. The sweet, sickly odor of decay. He was on his hands and knees, examining the mortar seams, when he heard footsteps behind him. "Father Byron." Sister Margaret's voice cut through the chapel's silence like a knife. "Whatever are you doing?" Thomas rose slowly, brushing dust from his cassock. "Preparing for Holy Week, Mother Superior. I thought the altar could use a thorough cleaning." "How devoted of you." Her eyes were cold, calculating, but unnecessary. "We have sisters assigned to such tasks. Your time would be better spent on spiritual matters." "Cleanliness is a spiritual matter," Thomas replied mildly. "The chapel is God's house. It should be maintained with appropriate care." They faced each other across the altar, and Thomas understood that battle lines were being drawn. Margaret knew he suspected something, and he knew that she knew. "I should mention," Margaret said, her voice deceptively casual, "that Father Murphy rarely involved himself in the practical affairs of the convent. He understood that a chaplain's role is to serve, not to investigate or interfere. His respect for boundaries was one of his most admirable qualities." "I'm sure Father Murphy was an excellent priest," Thomas said, "but I'm not Father Murphy. I take my responsibilities seriously, all of them, including the responsibility to ensure that this sacred space hasn't been defiled by sin." The word hung between them. Defiled. Margaret's composure cracked for just an instant, revealing something cold and vicious beneath. "Be very careful, Father," she said softly. "False accusations are themselves sinful. scandalizing the faithful, undermining legitimate authority, sowing discord in a religious house. These are grave matters. The bishop would be disappointed to learn that his new chaplain was causing problems. The bishop would be more disappointed to learn that crimes had been committed under his jurisdiction, and no one had the courage to report them, Thomas countered. They stood locked in silent confrontation, the weight of unspoken accusations pressing down on the chapel's ancient stones. Finally, Margaret turned and left without another word, her footsteps echoing through the vaulted space. Thomas remained at the altar, his heart pounding. He'd declared himself now. There was no going back, no possibility of pretending ignorance. He would have to see this through to whatever end awaited. That night, he wrote a detailed letter to Bishop O'Malley, outlining his concerns and the evidence he'd gathered. He sealed it carefully and entrusted it to a local boy who ran errands for the convent, paying him extra to deliver it directly to the cathedral offices, hand to hand, no intermediaries. Then he waited, praying he'd live long enough to see justice done, wondering how many bodies lay beneath the altar where he celebrated Mass each morning, offering the sacrifice of Christ above the sacrifices of Margaret's terrible devotion. The storm that would shake Boston's faith to its foundations was gathering strength, and Father Thomas Byrne stood at its center, armed with nothing but conscience and a stubborn refusal to look away from evil, even when it dressed itself in religious garb. The bishop arrived on a gray April morning with 2 officers from the Boston Police Department and a warrant issued by a judge who owed the church no particular favors. Sister Margaret met them at the door with her usual composure, but Thomas, watching from his window, could see the rigidity in her spine, the way her hands clenched at her sides. "Your Excellency," she said, her voice perfectly controlled, "this is unexpected. Had we known you were coming, we would have prepared properly." "This isn't a social call, Sister Margaret," Bishop O'Malley replied, his usually jovial face set in grim lines. Thomas had met with him 3 days prior, presenting his evidence and suspicions. The bishop had aged a decade in that single meeting, the weight of potential scandal bowing his shoulders. But to his credit, he hadn't tried to suppress the investigation. "We need access to your chapel, specifically to the area beneath the altar." Margaret's face went pale, then flushed with sudden rage. "This is outrageous. You would desecrate consecrated ground based on the hysterical accusations of—" "Based on evidence," the bishop interrupted. "Letters to convents that never received the sisters supposedly transferred there, financial irregularities in your ledgers, testimony from multiple witnesses about suspicious circumstances, and Father Byrne's observations about the altar and the floor beneath it." Thomas descended the stairs, feeling Margaret's eyes burn into him. She looked at him with pure hatred, no longer bothering to mask it behind piety. "You," she hissed, "you've destroyed everything. Decades of work, of sacrifice, of building something perfect." "Perfect?" Thomas couldn't keep the revulsion from his voice. "You call murder perfect? I call it necessary." Margaret's composure finally shattered. Those women were poison. They would have destroyed the church with their gossip and their moral weakness. They would have exposed our benefactors to scandal, driven away the donations that kept this place running. I did what was required to protect God's work. The confession fell into shocked silence. Even the police officers, hardened Boston Irishmen who'd seen their share of depravity, looked stunned. "Sister Margaret," the bishop said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "you're relieved of all authority. Officers, please escort her to the parlor and keep her there. Father Byrne, show us the altar." What followed would haunt Thomas's dreams for the rest of his life. The police brought in workmen who carefully dismantled the marble altar piece by piece. Beneath it, they found a cavity carved into the stone floor, roughly 8 feet long and 5 feet wide. And within that cavity, wrapped in habits that had once been white but were now stained dark, lay 7 bodies in various states of decomposition. The smell, when the cavity was first opened, was overwhelming. Sisters vomited. The bishop made the sign of the cross with a shaking hand. The police officers covered their faces and cursed softly. Thomas forced himself to look, to bear witness. These were the sisters who'd dared to question, who'd threatened Margaret's perfect order. Sister Mary Catherine, Sister Josephine, Sister Bernadette. He matched faces to names from the photographs in the convent records. All young, all bright-eyed in their photos, all reduced now to horrible evidence of how faith could curdle into fanaticism. The medical examiner determined that some had been suffocated, others poisoned with laudanum mixed into their evening tea. All had been buried within hours of death, hidden beneath the weight of marble and mortar, their existence erased from all records except Margaret's private ledger, which the police found in her quarters, a meticulous accounting of every necessary death, every obstacle removed in service of her twisted vision. The trial that followed captivated Boston. Newspapers ran daily updates, each revelation more sensational than the last. The prosecution presented Margaret's ledger with its chilling entries. Sister M.K. disposed of, interfered with discipline. Sister J knew too much about the Cabot arrangement, dealt with accordingly. Sister B planning exposure prevented permanently. The defense tried to argue insanity, but Margaret herself undermined that strategy. She took the stand and spoke for 3 hours, her voice never wavering, explaining with perfect rationality why each murder had been necessary, how she'd been protecting the church, preserving the moral order, doing God's will. These women were weak, she declared from the witness stand. They would have destroyed everything with their softness, their questioning, their inability to understand that sometimes love requires cruelty. I loved the church more than I loved them. I loved God more than I loved life itself. If that's madness, then every saint who ever lived was mad. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on 7 counts of murder in the first degree. The sentencing hearing drew even larger crowds. Thomas testified, describing his investigation and the horrors unearthed beneath the altar. Catherine testified, breaking down as she described the atmosphere of fear, the suspicious disappearances, her own terror that she would be next. Other sisters confirmed the systematic abuse, the way Margaret had ruled through intimidation and violence masked as religious discipline. The judge, a Protestant with little sympathy for Catholic institutional structures, handed down a harsh sentence: life imprisonment with no possibility of parole, to be served at the Massachusetts State Prison. But it was Margaret's final statement, delivered before she was led away, that would echo through Boston's Catholic community for years to come. "You call me a monster," she said, standing straight despite the chains on her wrists. "But I did only what the church has always done, protected itself from those who would weaken it. Every inquisitor, every enforcer of orthodoxy throughout history has understood that mercy to the dangerous is cruelty to the faithful. I regret nothing. If I had it to do again, I would change nothing. I am guilty only of loving God too much to let imperfect humans destroy His church." The scandal reverberated through Boston's Catholic community. 4 wealthy benefactors were exposed as having used St. Agnes to hide their daughters' pregnancies and other improprieties, paying Margaret handsomely for her discretion and silence. The archdiocese was forced to implement new oversight protocols for religious houses. Dozens of convents were inspected. Several were closed after investigations revealed various abuses. St. Agnes itself was deconsecrated and eventually torn down. The bodies of the murdered sisters were given proper Catholic burials in a different cemetery, their families finally able to mourn. A memorial was erected, 7 white crosses, each bearing a name, and the inscription, "Murdered for Truth." Catherine left religious life entirely. Thomas helped her secure a teaching position at a secular girls' school, where she taught Latin and advocated fiercely for her students, always alert to signs of abuse or institutional cruelty. She never fully recovered from her time at St. Agnes, waking often from nightmares of stone walls and marble altars. But she survived. Survival itself was a form of victory. Thomas continued as a priest, but his faith had been permanently altered by what he'd witnessed. He'd seen how easily devotion could become delusion, how institutional loyalty could justify atrocity, how the language of religion could be weaponized against the very people it was meant to protect. He spent the rest of his career advocating for transparency and accountability within the church, often to the frustration of his superiors. He never forgot the faces of those 7 young women, never stopped asking himself if he could have done more, acted faster, saved them. Sister Margaret died in prison in 1904, 7 years after her conviction. She maintained her innocence to the end, insisting that history would vindicate her, that future generations would understand that she'd been right to protect the church at any cost. She spent her final years writing theological treatises that no publisher would touch, dense arguments about divine authority and necessary sacrifice. Her body was claimed by no one. She was buried in the prison cemetery, beneath a simple marker bearing only her name and dates. No cross, No religious inscription. The church she'd loved so obsessively wanted no association with her memory. On the anniversary of the altar's excavation, Thomas would return to where St. Agnes once stood. The land had been sold, a warehouse built on the site, but he could still picture the Gothic towers, the dark corridors, the chapel where evil had hidden behind prayer. He would stand there and pray not for Margaret, though Christian charity demanded he try, but for her victims, for Mary Catherine, Josephine, Bernadette, Anne, Helena, Cecilia, and Teresa, 7 women who'd dared to question, who'd threatened imperfect power with inconvenient truth, who'd paid for their courage with their lives, and he would pray that the church, that all institutions that claimed divine authority, would learn from this horror, that they would remember that God's love is meant to protect the vulnerable, not sacrifice them on the altar of institutional preservation, that devotion without compassion is indistinguishable from cruelty, that no cause, however holy, justifies murder. But Thomas knew, with the bitter wisdom of experience, that the lesson would need to be learned again and again, in generation after generation, because the temptation to mistake power for righteousness, control for holiness, institutional survival for God's will, that temptation was eternal. The story of Sister Margaret and the convent of St. Agnes became a dark legend in Boston, whispered about in Catholic schools, cited in sermons about the dangers of spiritual pride, referenced in debates about church authority and accountability. Some tried to bury it, to pretend it hadn't happened. Others used it as propaganda, proof of Catholic barbarism for those already inclined to believe such things. But for those willing to look honestly at the horror, it offered a more complex and troubling lesson, that good people, convinced of their righteousness, can commit unspeakable evil, that institutions designed to preserve moral order can become engines of oppression, that the most dangerous zealots are those who believe they're doing God's work. The frozen harbor of 1897 had long since thawed. The convent stones were scattered, repurposed, forgotten, but the truth remained, unearthed and preserved, a warning, a memorial, a reminder that faith without humanity is not faith at all, but its demonic shadow. And beneath it all, the eternal question that would haunt Boston's Catholics and trouble Thomas's prayers until his dying day. How many other altars hide similar sins? How many Sister Margarets still operate in the shadows, convinced that their cruelty is love, their violence is holiness, their murders are sacrifices necessary to preserve what they've decided God requires? The answer, Thomas feared, was more than anyone wanted to know.